They laughed at him before he even fired a single shot. The sound of young Marines chuckling spread across the firing line as an elderly man stepped onto Camp Pendleton's outdoor shooting range. His rifle, long and weathered, looked like it had been pulled out of a glass case at a museum. "That thing belongs in history, not on a range?" One Marine whispered loud enough for his buddies to hear. The laughter grew louder as the old man calmly began setting up at an empty position as if he hadn't noticed a thing. It was qualification day, and Alpha Company's newest Marines were full of swagger. The Southern California sun burned down on the open range, the air heavy with the smell of gun oil and freshly cut grass. It was a day they had trained for since leaving boot camp. Every shot recorded, every score compared, reputations made or broken. More than 20 Marines lined up their M4 carbines, gleaming in the morning light. The rifles had every advantage: optical sights, rails, grips, bipods, modern weapons designed to deliver speed and accuracy. The young men and women handling them were buzzing with energy, adjusting straps, trading jokes, and boasting about the high scores they were sure to post. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen walked slowly behind them, his eyes sharp and steady. At 35, Chen had seen dozens of cocky recruits come and go. He knew the sound of bravado too well, the kind that disappeared the moment bullets started flying at paper silhouettes 300 to 500 yards away. He let them enjoy their chatter, knowing that humility often arrived in the form of poor scores. But then at the far end of the line, a figure appeared who didn't fit. He moved with the slow deliberation of age, each step measured but steady. His clothes were plain faded jeans, a gray t-shirt, and a worn baseball cap without insignia. No uniform, no rank displayed. Just another civilian or so, it seemed. What caught every eye wasn't the man himself, but the rifle he carried. Long, heavy wood and steel, it was unmistakably a relic. The kind of weapon most of these Marines had only seen in history books or war movies. "Holy crap, look at Grandpa," muttered. Private Jake Morrison, a 19-year-old from Texas, whose mouth often ran faster than his brain. "Is that even legal to shoot?" The man ignored the whispers. With practiced care, he laid down a small leather case, opened it, and began arranging rounds of ammunition that looked almost handmade. The brass casings bore the dull sheen of decades, as though they had been waiting all this time for this very morning. Staff Sergeant Chen stepped forward. Rules were rules, and no one handled a weapon on his range without clearing it first. "Sir, I need to check your range card and see some identification." Chen said, his voice firm but respectful. His eyes flicked to the rifle, curious despite himself. "And what kind of weapon is that?" The old man looked up, and his eyes were sharp, steady, almost unsettling in their clarity. "M1 Garand, 30-06 Springfield," he replied evenly. Then he handed over a weathered ID card. Chen's brows rose as he read it. "Retired Master Sergeant William Bill Hayes. Service dates 1965 to 1995. Vietnam, Chen asked, doing the math on the man's age. "2 tours," Hayes answered quietly. 5th Special Forces Group. That simple statement carried weight. Even the cockiest Marines knew the reputation of Army Special Forces. The chuckles grew quieter, though not completely gone. After all, this was still just a frail-looking old man with a rifle older than their parents. Private Morrison, unable to resist, smirked and called out, "No offense, Sergeant Hayes, but are you sure that thing's safe to shoot? Looks like it might blow up in your hands." A ripple of laughter followed. Hayes only smiled. "She's been reliable for 60 years. I think she'll hold together a little longer," he said softly, his hands moving with the smooth rhythm of long habit. Another Marine pointed downrange at the faint silhouette target sitting at the 300-yard line. "Yeah, but can you even see that far?" Hayes didn't break stride as he slid a clip of 8 rounds into the rifle. The distinctive metallic ping echoed across the range, foreign to every ear present except his own. He looked at the young Marine and said, "My eyes work fine, son." The range command crackled over the loudspeakers. "Line is hot. Shooters, take your positions." 20 Marines dropped into prone, their carbines clattering softly against the gravel. Optics adjusted safety selectors, click bipods dug into dirt. A storm of firepower was about to be unleashed. At the very end of the line, Hayes lowered himself onto the mat with the calm grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. No optics, no gadgets. Just iron sight, steady breathing, and a pair of hands that had once carried the fate of men through war. The Marines were still adjusting their gear when he became perfectly still. His cheek settled against the stock of his Garand. For him, the world had already gone silent. The targets snapped upright. The command rang out, "Engage." And that's when the lesson of the day truly began. The crack of rifles exploded almost at once. The Marines fired eagerly, their M4 carbines snapping out sharp, efficient bursts in semi-automatic mode. The sound was modern mechanical, the kind of rhythm that spoke of technology and repetition. Dust kicked up along the firing line as the young recruits tried to prove themselves, each one convinced that speed and firepower would impress their peers. But cutting through the chatter of 20 rifles came a sound unlike any other. Boom! A single, deep, commanding report echoed across the range. It was the voice of history itself, the unmistakable thunder of the M1 Garand. Every head twitched slightly at that sound. It didn't belong here, not among sleek polymer rifles with optics and rails. It was older, heavier, and yet somehow more final. Hayes moved with precision that seemed out of place in this modern crowd. He didn't rush. He didn't fumble with adjustments. He lay in the prone position, body still breathing slow. His finger curled around the trigger with the patience of decades. Boom! Another shot. Then silence again, broken only by the hurried clatter of the young Marines. They fired in rapid succession, trying to maximize their chances of hitting the targets. But as the seconds passed, something unsettling became clear. The usual clang of bullets striking steel targets wasn't echoing back nearly as often as it should have. Meanwhile, every time Hayes fired, that metallic clang answered back without fail. Private Morrison stole a glance sideways. What he saw tightened his chest. The old man wasn't just hitting his targets, he was drilling them. The silhouette at 300 yards had holes clustered neatly in the center mass. 400 yards showed the same cruel precision. And then there was the impossible. At 500 yards, a distance that strained even the scoped carbines of the recruits, Hayes's shots landed dead center. Each impact echoed like a hammer on an anvil. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Staff Sergeant Chen's voice cut through the noise as the qualification period ended. Weapons lowered, safeties clicked on, and the Marines exhaled in relief. Some laughed nervously, certain they had done well enough to pass. But Chen wasn't laughing. He was staring downrange with furrowed brows. He raised binoculars and swept across the targets. What he saw made him call out instantly. "Range safety. Get me a score on lane 21. All targets 100 through 500. The gunnery sergeant in charge of safety, checks a man who had overseen thousands of qualifications, lifted his own scope. Within seconds, his voice erupted, carrying down the line for all to hear. "Holy Mother of God." The Marines fell silent. Their earlier bravado drained away as range staff began collecting the targets. One by one, they were laid out on tables in front of the company. The murmurs began immediately. At 100 yards, every round in the center grouped so tight you could cover it with a silver dollar. At 300 yards, the same. At 400 yards, a near-perfect cluster, not a single stray round. And at 500 yards, the range where most recruits were happy just to land a bullet anywhere on the paper. Hayes had punched an 8-round group so precise, it looked like machine work. The laughter from earlier had turned into stunned silence. "That's impossible," one Marine muttered. "Nobody shoots like that without optics." But there it was. The proof was staring back at them, holes in paper that didn't lie. The gunnery sergeant shook his head, still in disbelief. "I've seen expert marksmen, competitive shooters, even snipers who could make you doubt your own skills. But this, with iron sights, I've never seen anything like it." Staff Sergeant Chen turned toward Hayes. The old man was calmly cleaning his Garand, his movements unhurried, almost ritualistic. It was as if the demonstration had been nothing out of the ordinary. Master Sergeant Hayes Chen called. "Can you explain how you just outshot 20 Marines with modern equipment using a rifle from World War II? Hayes paused, wiped the bolt with a cloth, and looked up. His reply was simple. Practice. Lots and lots of practice. The words hung in the air, but they weren't enough. Not for the recruits whose pride had just been shattered. Private Morrison's face flushed with both embarrassment and awe stepped forward. "Come on," he said. "It's got to be more than that. What's your secret? For the first time since stepping onto the range, Hayes set his rifle down and truly studied the young faces gathered around him. Gone were the smirks, the arrogance, the mockery. What remained was curiosity, hunger. You want to know the real difference between your shooting and mine? Hayes asked quietly. Every Marine leaned in, waiting. You were all trying to hit targets. I was trying to stop threats. The distinction was subtle, but the weight in his voice made it sink deep. Every time you pulled that trigger, you were thinking about scores, about qualification standards, about impressing each other. Every time I pulled mine, I was thinking about lives, my brother's lives, my own. The firing line, once filled with noise and bravado, was now wrapped in silence. The words of the old soldier had cut deeper than any bullet could. Somewhere beyond the quiet, the sun beat down on the range, and the breeze carried the smell of spent gunpowder. But no one noticed. Every Marine's focus was locked on the man who had just reminded them what a rifle truly meant in the hands of a warrior. Faces, Hayes repeated softly, almost to himself. The word carried weight, and the Marines leaned in closer. Even Staff Sergeant Chen, who had seen his share of hardened warriors, stood silent, waiting for the old man to continue. Hayes closed the lid on his ammo case, then rested both hands on the Garand's worn stock. His eyes, still sharp, seemed to look past the range, past the sunlit hills of California, into a place far darker. In 1968, he began, his voice steady but low. My squad was outside Da Nang. We were pinned down by a sniper. Couldn't see him, couldn't find him, but every few minutes, one of my boys tried to move, and then he paused, the weight of memory pressing down on him. Then another Marine didn't get back up. The recruits swallowed hard. Even Morrison, usually quick with a joke, kept his mouth shut. I finally caught the glint of muzzle flash. 400 yards, thick jungle. I knew I had one chance, maybe two. If I missed, more of my brothers would die. His eyes narrowed, remembering. Iron sights. One breath. One squeeze. Enemy sniper eliminated. And for the first time in hours, silence returned. That shot wasn't about a score on paper. It was about life or death. That's what I mean when I say faces. Every time I pulled the trigger, I remembered them, the men who counted on me. The range was silent, the weight of his words pressing into the hearts of every Marine present. But that was only one day, Hayes continued. Over 13 months in country, I took 47 lives, ranges from 100 to 600 yards. Every single shot was meant to keep my brothers alive. Every single shot carried a name, a memory, a reason. You can't imagine what that does to a man unless you've been there. He let out a breath long and heavy, as if he'd been carrying it for decades. The recruits shifted uncomfortably, realizing they were standing in the presence of someone who had not just fired a rifle, but had lived through the responsibility that came with it. Some people call it skill, others call it talent, Hayes said quietly. But I'll tell you the truth, it was necessity. Missing meant funerals. Missing meant writing letters home to mothers. That's why I don't miss, because I couldn't afford to. Private Morrison's face softened. The cocky 19-year-old from Texas no longer saw a frail old man with a museum piece. He saw a warrior who had carried the weight of life and death through the jungles of Southeast Asia. Staff Sergeant Chen finally broke the silence. With all due respect, Master Sergeant, why didn't you tell us this when you first arrived? Hayes adjusted the strap on his rifle case. Because it doesn't matter who I was. What matters is what you can learn. And today, if you paid attention, you learned that all your optics and technology mean nothing if you don't respect the fundamentals. He tapped the Garand gently, almost like patting the shoulder of an old friend. Patience, breathing, trigger discipline, respect for the weapon. That's what keeps you alive. He turned and began walking toward the parking area. The gravel crunched under his boots, but the silence behind him was louder than any sound. Wait, Morrison called out suddenly, his voice cracking. Sergeant Hayes, could you, maybe, teach us? Show us how to shoot like you. Hayes stopped. For a long moment, he didn't turn around. Then slowly he looked back. For the first time that day, his face broke into a broad smile. Son, he said, his voice carrying both warmth and challenge. I've been waiting 60 years for someone to ask me that question. The recruits exchanged glances. The same young men who had laughed at him minutes before now looked at him with awe, as though they were standing before a legend. And in a way they were. Hayes slung the rifle over his shoulder and walked off into the fading sunlight, leaving behind not just the echo of his shots, but the beginning of a lesson that would change Alpha Company forever. 3 weeks later, Master Sergeant Hayes returned to the range. This time he wasn't alone. What began with Private Morrison and a handful of curious Marines quickly grew into something much larger. Word had spread like wildfire across Camp Pendleton. The old soldier with the World War II rifle had outshot an entire platoon and left them speechless. By Saturday morning, dozens of Marines waited at the firing line, eager not to mock but to learn. Hayes didn't just teach them how to shoot. Yes, his marksmanship techniques were sharp and his instruction was precise, but his lessons went deeper than sight alignment and trigger squeeze. He taught patience. He taught discipline. And above all, he taught respect for the weapon, for the craft, for the responsibility that came with holding a rifle. Your rifle isn't a toy, he told them, holding up the Garand as though it were sacred. It isn't a tool for bragging rights. It's the line between you and the man who wants to kill you. Treat it with reverence and it will serve you well. Treat it like a game, and it will betray you when it matters most. The Marines listened. They slowed their breathing. They steadied their hands. They stopped competing with each other and started listening to the rhythm of their own hearts. Under Hayes's watchful eye, they learned that marksmanship was less about speed and more about presence. Each shot mattered. Each shot had weight. 6 months after that first unforgettable day, Alpha Company posted the highest marksmanship qualification scores in the battalion's history. Private Jake Morrison, the same 19-year-old who had once laughed at Hayes's rifle, earned his expert marksman badge and was recommended for sniper training. But perhaps more importantly, every Marine who trained with Hayes carried forward a mindset that would serve them far beyond the shooting range. They learned that mastery was not in the weapon, but in the warrior who wielded it. And Hayes, he kept coming back. Every Saturday without fail, he drove on to base with his battered leather ammo case and his faithful M1 Garand. Week after week, he set up at the same firing position where the laughter had once greeted him, and week after week, he reminded the next generation what true skill looked like. There was no more mockery, no more smirks, only quiet respect when the old man lowered himself onto the mat and showed again and again that fundamentals outlast technology. One morning, the Marines surprised him. At the very spot where he had first set up a small bronze plaque had been mounted into the ground. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything Hayes had shown them. Dedicated to Master Sergeant William Hayes, who taught us that the weapon doesn't make the warrior. The warrior makes the weapon. Hayes never asked for it. He never mentioned it when he arrived. He simply nodded, set up his rifle, and went back to work because, for him, this was never about recognition. It was about passing on knowledge that could save lives. And so he continues even now, teaching Marines a lesson they will carry into battle, into life, and into memory. That true mastery comes not from the newest gear, but from the patience, discipline, and respect to use any tool to its fullest potential. Sometimes the greatest teachers don't look like heroes. Sometimes they look like old men with worn rifles and steady hands. But those who listen, who watch, who learn, walk away changed forever. So the next time you hear someone dismiss experience as outdated, remember the story of Master Sergeant Hayes. The man who silenced a firing line not with words, but with the sound of 8 deliberate shots. Because in the end, it isn't the weapon that defines the warrior. It's the warrior who defines the weapon. And if you believe stories like this should be remembered, if you want more tales of the quiet heroes who shaped history, make sure to leave a comment, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss the next one.